Welcome everybody, and as Emily said, my name's David Rogers. I'm quite heavily involved in this work globally, and I've written a number of the papers that are referred to in the documentation, and I'm involved in working on the legislation in the UK as well. So, as Emily mentioned, one of the reasons that we put vulnerability disclosure as one of those top 3 things in the code of practice and ultimately in legislation is because if we don't, it's no good as just securing the product if we don't know what's happening in the field. If we have no way for the good guys to contact us, then we don't really complete the cycle. That, as we'll see in this presentation, there are a number of people that want to do us harm, want to do our products harm, and we should ally ourselves with those people who are really the good guys in all of this. So what is vulnerability disclosure? Well, it's essentially a set of rules by which companies and security researchers can interact in a way which penalizes neither. This has developed over a number of years, and it's really been organic, and it has been a learning process for both sides. And we've really reached a very mature stage. Again, this is another reason why we're ready to sort of mandate this, in that there's a common understanding now between the corporate world and the hacking world of how best to interact. It can be fraught. There is disagreement on either side always, and there is a different set of cultures coming together, which can create fireworks sometimes, and we have to manage that very, very carefully. But today it's recognized as an important component in overall cybersecurity and keeping users safe. But it's quite surprising about how many people don't know about vulnerability disclosure and don't know that this is best practice. When we come to the examples, I'll talk about some cases where that's created some interesting situations. Now, vulnerabilities can put user safety, personal data, networks, and devices at risk. And a poorly managed vulnerability disclosure can result in reputation and financial damage. And in some cases, researchers are not really interested in disclosing that to your company and that being it. They're more interested in going public and getting fame and glory. And so there are sort of 2 sides to that coin, in terms of there are a lot of genuine people who really, really want to feel a sort of a public need to help you as a company, that they feel it's the right thing to do. But there are many different drivers as to why security researchers approach companies, and why some companies will then roll out the lawyers in response, which is the wrong response, by the way. But failure to respond to a reported vulnerability may result ultimately in a public disclosure. And if you don't understand that properly, it's really an uncontrolled public disclosure, and it can escalate massively before you've had a chance to fix it, and exposing users and consumers of your product potentially to risk. So it really is in your interest to manage these. As soon as you've got a report in, then you're in control of the situation. Up until that point, you are not in control at all. And of course, any security researcher is free to expose vulnerabilities in your products publicly. That's not a criminal act. If they start tampering with your systems, then in most countries that is a criminal act. But if they bought and paid for a product and they're tinkering with it, that is not criminal. They're free to be able to do that, and they're free to be able to research it. It's not a problem. So let's have a look at this, the rest of this then. So what do we mean by vulnerabilities specifically? Well, of course, vulnerabilities can appear in all parts of products and services. It could include the hardware of the product itself. If you're creating some kind of device, um, there could be issues there. But the software that's running on that product, any third-party software components that you bring in and use, so things like open source libraries. Most IoT solutions now are actually multiple products. So if you've got a consumer IoT solution, you're going to have a mobile application, you're probably going to have some kind of cloud service and storage, and you're going to have devices and sensors associated with that, and maybe even a gateway. So you've got all of these different products, all of which probably have multiple vulnerabilities. More generally, we have industry-wide vulnerabilities. So, for example, within the standards that you're using, the communication standards, there will be vulnerabilities too. So we've got this whole situation which could be a mess, but is starting to improve. And what we're seeing now is the patching of those vulnerabilities and the more frequent deployment of fixes to those through software updates and so on. And so creating this ecosystem of responsible disclosure and or vulnerability reporting results in an overall more secure and more safe cyber ecosystem. Going back to vulnerabilities, all software has vulnerabilities. All software has bugs, so some of those bugs will result in vulnerabilities, and then a further subset of those will be exploitable vulnerabilities. So not all of the vulnerabilities that are reported to you will be exploitable now, but it's important that you consider that they could be exploitable in the future, or they could be chained together with other things. So something that to you doesn't necessarily look like a vulnerability could in the future be something like that, or it could be something related to another part of the system. So it's really important that you do assess these things properly, but also within the context of that you yourself, your company is actively looking for vulnerabilities in your products. And it's really, really important to emphasize that you have those internal processes, first of all, to hunt out, address vulnerabilities in a structured manner, that you don't just rely on external reports for when you're finding things. And equally, in terms of threat monitoring as well, that you're actively looking at how people are trying to tamper with your products in the market, and looking at what's happening with your competitors too. That's really, that threat monitoring is something that I see companies just not doing. And if you know what's coming, if you know how these people are doing it, it's kind of like a crystal ball. You start to understand what's going on, and to be able to address it before it hits you and before it becomes a problem. So who are security researchers, or reporters as we call them in the ISO specification for this? Well, there's a bit of a cliche in this industry, and you see it a lot in news media, of the hacker in a hoodie. That may be the case in a small number of cases, but in reality, many of the security researchers that I deal with are academics working in universities, who are really looking at a deep level of these products and of the specifications that they're run on. And they're doing this work as probably part of something to do with their PhD maybe, or postdoc work. And they have no malign intent at all. They may not understand how you build your products, but they're coming to you to report an issue, and they do expect it to be fixed. They expect a company to address these problems. But their ultimate aim is to publish their work at a conference. And so they do want to go public with it. They do want to get that information on their CV. But really, they're not seeking to attack you as a company. And if you're able to work with those security researchers, then you perhaps get some good PR out of the end of that as well as they get their work published. I think one of the issues is where companies throw out legal threats, particularly at university researchers, because that really is an attack on the freedom of speech and the freedom to publish. And we've seen a number of incidents in the past where universities themselves have come to legally defend security researchers who are academics within their organizations, and it's not come off very well for the companies involved because it doesn't look good, to be frank. But it's not just university researchers, it could be individuals. So last year there was a boy who found a bug in an Apple product, and they were able to report that through the Apple CVD scheme, and ultimately the issue got fixed. And this is another example of where companies don't believe something is an issue, and then on reassessment they realize that it actually is. But really, you don't necessarily know who's going to come to you, and you don't necessarily know who's going to find something. So don't apply prejudices or your own internal corporate prejudice to people who come to you, and assess each report carefully and understand it. We see a lot of interested individuals, people who are traditional hackers who are just doing their own research. They're interested in a particular area. So for example, I look at the moment a lot of automotive researchers. These basically are petrol heads, and they have a genuine interest in what they're taking apart, and that they're looking at stuff in a way that perhaps your own employees won't look at, in that they have that really deep level interest. And what we also see is a lot of people who would be considered neurodiverse. So a lot of people in the hacking world are on the spectrum in some way, on the autistic spectrum, and they do look at things in a completely different way. And what you have to understand when dealing with neurodiverse individuals is that they may not understand the world in the same way as you do. And so you have to really treat these security researchers in a very special way, and essentially be nice. And that may sound really weird, but in a highly stressful situation where a company's reported a vulnerability to you in an unsolicited message, it's often the case that companies react extremely badly. They don't respond constructively, and they see it as an attack. And that is almost always the point at which things start to go wrong. It is always in your interests to keep the conversation nice and friendly. And what I always say to companies when I'm advising them is, find the nicest person that you know in the company and put them onto the communications with the security researcher. That front of house doesn't necessarily need to be the pure technical person, but it's the person that keeps the relationship going with the security researcher. And it's a common error that companies make, and it creates a lot of conflict. But it's not just interested individuals either, it's companies too. So for example, Google runs its own team under a group called Project Zero, and they report vulnerabilities. They're assessing vulnerabilities in products that they use as a company. And so they will report into other companies. Security research organizations such as penetration testing companies, security companies will often also report vulnerabilities to companies as they find them. So, as I say, a lot of the experience is very, very good when you're working with security researchers, but we have to say that there are some bad faith disclosures, and you have to be careful with that communication as well, where individuals may seek to blackmail you. They may tell you something that is completely wrong, or they may be setting out to expose you as a company. So you have to just be very, very careful about those communications in a sort of trust but verify manner.